If you're in a healthy frame of mind, you take your humanity for granted. And this answers a lot of other questions we've wrestled with a little bit on the podcast. You can take your manhood for granted. You can take your womanhood for granted.
Well, hang on.
You won't,
So, the way you're using this phrase is opposite of the way that most people connotate it. So we need to, because we use taking it for granted as a bad thing, almost always. Like, oh, I take my whatever for granted. And you're not using it that way. You're using it the other way around. Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
Cameron, I think, oddly enough, you and I have been independently and unbeknownst to each other working on some similar talks and ideas. And I want to go back over, I gave a talk at UVA the last week, and you're about to give a talk at a college next week. And I wanted to play with some of the themes and work those out and maybe give either a simplified version of that or a more complex and nuanced look at some of these features. But both of them have to do with how we think about identity or not, and the way that we think about community and whether or not we need community to know who we are, and then particularly how religious community plays into that. And, you've been doing some research and have some funny, very simple ideas on why a lot of the stuff we don't even need to worry about. But my challenge here, and I think this is important for all Christians to listen to, is that, and we'll flesh this out and give examples, is that as people feel that the culture around them is getting more wonky, we start latching on to things that in the past we wouldn't have in the same way, or perhaps we tend to start idolizing other features. Think of the imagery of like sliding off of a mountainside and you're about to go over a cliff. You don't care what kind of branch you grab. Even if it has thorns on it, you're going to grab it because you see that as your last salvation before you go, plummeting over the edge. And so there's the things that we grasp in desperation are things that I think we want to be careful about as Christians. So let me give you a brief outline on where I was going with that, and then I'd love to hear some of your thoughts in this. So one of those is that when we understand and sense cultural confusion and instability, then we start looking for personal stability. And we can kind of look back over history and around the world and say, here's some features that provide like a really stable personal identity. And in my mind, these are stacked like Russian dolls. So the biggest one is theology. Inside of that is geography. And then you have some kind of sub-community, tribe, clan, subculture, denomination. Then you have family inside of that, and then the individual. So from just while you're picturing these little circles inside your mind, I'll work it back out the other way. So individuals and a family and a subculture and a geography and a theology. And it's easy to prove that point. If you start at the middle, you can think of your first name. That's your personal identity. Then you probably have a last name, family identity. Your family's part of a tribe, clan, subgroup of some sort. You lived in a place. People ask each other, where are you from, as a way of understanding who they are. And then all of that is worked out in some sort of meta narrative or big story, which has always been theological in the past. So people say, okay, that's the way that you have a stable identity. I'll just build one of those. And the way that we oddly get into this is we say, well, I'll start with myself. I'll figure out who am I, and then I'll think about what does family mean, and then I'll think about who my tribe is, and then my geography. So either my patriotism or my nationalism, and then some people stop at any point along the way, and then I'll try to find a religion that works with all of that. And so there's this sense here that as we sense cultural tension, we try to look at the good elements of stability and build those ourselves. And there's a little bit of a Tower of Babel element that happens here where I'll just construct my own stability. And I think for a while I fell into that of saying, okay, look, and I know a lot of evangelical Christians who are really serious about taking care of their bodies and their finances and personal stewardship and identity and knowing who you are in Christ. Fine. Really focus on the family and of building small businesses and healthy community around them who, love the places that they live and owning property. And all these create great forms of stability. And you say, this is how culture is formed. This is the way that we do that. And there's a lot of exciting and there's a lot of value to it and a lot of goodness to that, except there's this one guy who pops the bubble on that, Jesus, who says that that's not how it works. That unless you're willing to leave your, unless if you don't love him more than your family, than your fields, than everything around you, you aren't worthy to be his disciples. He does not start at like, let's really sort out the individual. Get yourself sorted. If you want to be great in God's kingdom, learn to be the servant of all. If anyone does not deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. Um, he says, seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all these other things will be added. When it comes to what will we eat, what will we wear, and all the main anxiety and concern. And so it's this very much top down, get yourself, allow the Lord to put you in proper relationship with him, start at the outside, and then allow him to fill in the details on the inside. And we sense that as a frustration in our culture. I think it even within a lot of Christian lives of saying, well, no, actually, if I just had good community, everything would be okay. And that's not the pattern that I see in scripture for how that actually works. So I'm sensing a tension here on the things that we can celebrate as legitimately good, but we dare not fall into the trap of idolizing them or thinking that they're primary rather than derivative of a gift from God. I packed a lot in there in 4 minutes to set this up, but A, do you sense some, am I right? B, am I sensing some of the same things you are? And then C, like, how are the helpful ways that we make progress in these categories, affirming the good, but not idolizing them as we live in a wonky world?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, let's go in order, I guess. A, are you right? Yeah, I mean, I think you're onto something. There are points of overlap in our thought here. Let me start like this, and this is a bit of a roundabout way. There's a running theme that I've been noticing in Scripture. So self-consciousness is almost never a good thing in Scripture, and it starts in the garden. When Adam and Eve become aware of their nakedness, it's not a good thing. Before, they weren't worried about it. They were in a happy state of mind. They were and it wasn't blissful ignorance would be the wrong way to put it. They were in
Content.
harmony. Yeah, they were in harmony with, first and foremost, with God, and they were in harmony with one another, and they were in harmony with their natural environment. And so that self-consciousness doesn't intrude until something has gone seriously wrong. I want to bring that up here because I think there are two salient facts I want to bring before us. One is the mental health crisis that we have been dealing with now for several years. And the outworkings, now the mental health crisis is coming about, Nathan, from relational breakdown.
Mm-hmm.
Relationship, first of all, with God, and then relationship with others. What we tend to do is very typical of modern people. We go after symptoms, and the symptoms are severe: chronic loneliness, depression, and suicide. I think those would be the three biggest. Gender dysphoria, we can list. I mean, you can list all of these. These are all symptoms. So you have the growing mental health crisis, which is undeniable. There's the one salient factor. And then the other one is that the great question of our moment is, what does it mean to be human? It's a profound question, but it's a question that comes about from a profoundly unhealthy frame of mind, not dissimilar to Adam and Eve recognizing their nakedness in the garden. Because if you're in a healthy frame of mind, you can take your humanity, you do take your humanity for granted. It doesn't enter into it doesn't occur to you to question it. We question our humanity under times of extreme circumstances. So chattel slavery, for instance, that's an occasion, a very tragic and horrific occasion where people did ask that question. And it was brought to the fore with great urgency. But again, those are unhealthy, bad, unnatural circumstances. And now we live in a moment where we have taken an approach to identity, and you were getting at this, that is completely novel. We see it as some sort of project that we are to realize ourselves. The example that always comes to mind for me, Nathan, is Jay Gatsby. Because in some ways, The Great Gatsby is one of the great American novels because it captures that tragic attempt to be a self-made man. Because Jay Gatsby is not Gatsby. His real name is James Gatz. And Fitzgerald renders this in very poetic language, but essentially, he creates a character.
But it
and
starts
through this
with
character,
it starts with renaming himself, though, which is not insignificant.
it starts with renaming himself. Absolutely. No, he renames himself. And he also believes a lot of things that we do today. He believes that you can somehow change the past. And there's one point where his neighbor, who's the narrator of the story, Nick Calloway, says, "Well, you can't change the past," because he wants to go back and he wants to win back his old flame, Daisy Miller, who's now with another man. And he looks at him. Well, of course you can. It describes this look of longing in his eyes, as though the past were in the shadows cast by the mansion that he lives in. And I think, people look to the White House. Sometimes we look to various different, we think maybe if we get the right person in the Oval Office, if we go to the right church, if the economy is set right again, if somehow we'll be able to make things better again like they were, and we can reclaim the past, and we can make the world better, and it'll come about through our own efforts. And I think we need to look at that and take a step back, take the lesson here from, because this story is a tragedy. It doesn't end well for Jay Gatsby. And I think we need to recognize that here's where you mentioned I have some simple takeaways here. Yeah, I do. If you're a Christian, and now you can take your identity for granted. So I said it's the question of what does it mean to be human is a profound one, but it arises from an unhealthy frame of mind. So we could state it positively. If you're in a healthy frame of mind, you take your humanity for granted. And this answers a lot of other questions we've wrestled with a little bit on the podcast. You can take your manhood for granted. You can take your womanhood for granted.
Well, hang on. The way you're using this phrase is opposite of the way that most people connotate it. So we need to, because we use taking it for granted as a bad thing almost always. Like, oh, I take my whatever for granted. And you're not using it that way. You're using it the other way around.
Oh no, I mean
so I just want to make sure that everybody's listening. When you hear Cameron say you can take your manhood for granted or your womanhood for granted, he's saying you have permission to do that. Like, you don't have to navel gaze all the time and try to figure out what this exactly means. There are some things that it's okay to run the autopilot on.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there are all sorts of realms of life where you want the autopilot on. You really don't want to drive with anybody who's not on autopilot in the sense that they're an experienced driver. If you're with somebody who's thinking about every single thing they're doing in the car, that's a pretty annoying ride or a pretty scary ride. And similarly, imagine you're with a group of people. Imagine you come across a group of construction workers. This will work with any group. Construction workers, mechanics, scientists, and they're all sitting around the construction site or the body shop or the laboratory. They're staring at all of their machinery and all of their equipment in complete and total bewilderment and confusion. Well, you'd rightfully conclude, man, something very basic but very profound has gone wrong here. This is a profound level of confusion. What's going on? Well, what do we think when we have gatherings on biblical manhood, biblical womanhood, or have conferences that on what it means to be a person? Or we have utterances like, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. I'm not speaking unsympathetically by any means. I'm saying these are signposts of true confusion.
Yeah, but you're sticking a knife in the neck of a significant portion of the evangelical conferences by saying, hey, we're not picking on, people who are confused about their gender, to say that some of the questions that we're asking as Christians fall into the exact same traps of like, do you wake up in the morning and sit around and wonder what it means to be awake? You probably don't.
Right.
So I'm torn here because I do think introspection is helpful. Although once you pointed it out, all the biblical examples of like, oh, there's Ecclesiastes. That's a real joyride. There's Jonah, not that great. So there's a sense in which people would say though, okay, by not being thoughtful and critically engaging, bad things happen because people are blind to. So we're not saying that the ignorance to the detriment of other people is bad. We're just saying that sometimes if you overanalyze what the thing is for, you're not going to be able to enjoy it for what it actually is. Am I
Well, yeah,
summarizing you here?
yes. I mean, and part of it, so we don't, I'll do away with take for granted for a second and just say you can rest in your humanity. You can
There you
rest
go.
in the
Yeah.
fact that you're a person. You can take you have security that you're a person. And if somebody were to put to you the question, who are you? The fundamental answer is I'm a child of God. I was made by God for God.
Okay, but
Now,
see, what
I
you're
want to
doing there, though, is you're flipping that around because you're assuming that your identity is received, not constructed.
right. So I am absolutely assuming that the identity is received, and that's a point of debate with the larger culture. It should not be a point of debate whatsoever with Christians. But yes, for those outside the church, that's completely up for debate. And there we look at the evidence, I think. We look at how human life actually unfolds and how human beings work. And we get profound, not definitive answers, we get profound clues. Because human beings, we are a mystery to ourselves. Because we don't have an outsider's perspective on what it means to be a person. There's a conflict of interest, you might say. We can't climb out of our human experience. That does not mean that we can't gain insights into our human experience. Of course we can. That does not mean that empathy isn't real. Of course it is. Doesn't mean we can't walk a mile in our shoes. Yes, we can. But it does mean that we don't have a comprehensive, you don't close the book on human nature, in other words. So there are certain problems that are solved in a definitive way. They have solutions or scientific problems that where we make the discovery, and it's a definitive discovery in the sense that, all right, now we know how this particular process works, and we can close the book on it, or you can assume it. You can't do that. It's not like Homer wrote the Odyssey and the Iliad. We can now close the book on that. We understand themes like revenge and honor and nobility, and there's nothing new to be said on those subjects because, well, Homer already said it. It sounds funny even putting it like that, because literature takes as its subject human experience and the mystery of what it means to be a person. That's one major aspect of it. And we don't exhaust that question. So there is the introspection and all of that is a profound pursuit. But I'm still going to suggest that the healthy frame of mind is you rest secure in the fact that you are a person. Now, that doesn't mean we don't engage critically with some of these questions. And again, we would do that, I'm assuming, out of service to our neighbors. But am I indicting some of our practices in the evangelical world? Yeah, I am. It's never sat easy for me. And I will put my cards on the table. You can push back. We can talk this through. And so I say this out of intellectual honesty, not of offense. But I've told you, Nathan, how when I've been invited to give a talk on, quote, biblical manhood, I've never felt comfortable with that because I think this is not something that needs to be enumerated or defended in this way. I think you can take.
All right.
Yeah. So I do have a problem with that. Yeah.
So I'm with you, but let me play devil's advocate here for a little bit.
Please do. You'll help me.
Because, all right. So a number of different things here. How do we want to go in this? Some of that might be because some of these things are so obvious to you that you've never had to think about them. But I would say that the proliferation of Jordan Peterson is a household name because he wrote a book saying clean your room. Like that, I'm pretty sure your dad talked to you about that at some point. So is it a fact that there's a certain amount of like relational and communal knowledge that you have that is so obvious to you that you don't have to think about it? But is it also possible that there are millions and millions of people who the things that you and I are assuming are normal are not, who really do need to be spoon-fed some steps on like basic social interactions with other humans? So that's one part. Well, actually, I'll let you respond to that first, and then I'll go to part two.
I think that's a fair question. It's probably true. I mean, you and I have had the massive benefit of good fathers, first of all, in our lives, which is something that cannot be taken for granted, tragically, in today's world. And also healthy church communities can't be taken for granted in today's world. However, there are plenty of wonderful fathers out there, and there are plenty of wonderful church communities out there as well. So I don't want to I don't want to run the risk of over exaggerating that factor. It is a factor, but I don't want to over exaggerate it too much. I also think there's a strong chance that some of the foreign concerns, foreign in the sense that they belong to the wider world, routinely creep into the church, and that all of us are as liable to temptation there as anybody else. And a lot of these questions having to do with basically iterations of identity politics, I do think that, and you can point to, and I can put on my nerdy intellectual hat and point to some of the trends that have swept through universities, what a lot of them having to do with first wave and second wave feminism. But it remains the case that if you take a hard look, for instance, let's look at masculinity. The problem is, if you want to go down the road of trying to construct some sort of a cultural picture of what masculinity looks like, you're going to come up with something that's very, very deconstructible. Whether you say, well, we've got to get out there again and use our hands and be gruff men and shoot things and eat them. And then we have to do man stuff. Well, not all men are like that. Well, we got to, pop the hood of the car and work on cars and do things like that. Well, not all men do that. Does that mean that they're less men? Is that? Yeah. I mean,
you run into a bigger problem. There's a bigger
Yeah.
problem than that. So you do end up with some like very culturally deconstructible things, but you also run up against the hard reality that most of the biblical corpus on what it means to be a man very rarely fits those cultural trends of what that means. So, I mean, it's a problem culturally speaking, but then in a biblical theological sense, it gets very difficult very fast to say, how is the love for cars play into what Jesus thought a man is? I'm not saying that those are disconnected or one of the other. I mean, there are some principles there, but we very quickly start to assume what the Bible says about what it means. Yeah.
We do. And we live in a world where we tend to blow the exceptions up and kind of make them the new rule. It's a very postmodern habit. The whataboutism of, oh, well, I know this man who's really into ballet and dance and just very, very doesn't like any of these things and doesn't push boundaries, didn't push boundaries as a baby and all that. So, but I still think, sure, that's true. There are always exceptions. But I think there are some general stereotypical modes of behavior that are actually pretty tried and tested. In my home, at least.
Yeah, I don't think we want to.
If you look at the differences between my son and my daughter, I mean, he's absolutely the boundary tester. He's absolutely the one who wants to know why I get to tell him what to do on everything. In a way, he's non-submissive in a way that Olivia is not. Now, that doesn't mean that he's, a natural born leader and all those, but some of those typical masculine traits that we tend to see in little boy, loves weapons, things like that. Those are all there. Now, did I rear him? I hate guns. Did I rear him to do that? Did I make him enthusiastic about things that, shoot people and blow? No. I mean, there seems to be something that was pretty innate right there. And when I was a kid, I loved that stuff too. I did. So I want to say those are real too. There are real, tangible differences, which may be deconstructible, but everything's deconstructible in a certain sense, that are still real and they are there. And I think so, but biblical masculinity can include that, or biblical womanhood could include some of those, what we would associate with, stereotypical feminine features, but it's going to be more than that too. These are roles that the Lord has conferred on men and women respectively, but also, biology is one of the major factors here, but our bodies, of course, are not insignificant. I think one of the big lies of our age is to say that your anatomy is interchangeable and dispensable.
Well, let me point out why that's
identity.
Yeah, let me point out why that's important though on the biological side. So you're talking about your son and the love of some. So I have a 10-year-old daughter who's spent more time hunting than you have, but it would never cross my mind that would be a.
She's more of a man than me, Nathan. Just kidding.
Well, but no. So I'm just saying that thought would never cross my mind. In the way that I think about what it means to be male or female, that those are
because
and she lives in a healthy culture.
You're in a healthy frame of.
Well, and she knows a lot of other very feminine women who also hunt. So it's
right, but some people would say that, Nathan. I think that's why I think that is a healthy frame of mind. The unhealthy frame of mind is you need to man up, Cameron, and get out there and match this 10-year-old girl. To which I'm honestly just going to say that's just silly.
And as she gets older, she might not be as interested in it. I mean, so all that this is a perfect example, though, I think, that we've proved our point of saying if you start trying to construct the cultural parameters, the New Testament says very little about hunting and manhood, if anything. So if you start to construct cultural,
because it takes it for granted. May I just suggest that to you?
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
I think we proved a good point by our little rabbit trail there. So here's let me bring this back around to another challenge, because I hear your point, and I think we want to be people who can embrace the what we consider statistically normal patterns and not make massive decisions based off of the exceptions. God knows what to do with exceptions, and I'm excited about that. But all right, so here's another takeaway though. Let's say that somebody looks at my little like fivefold, or it'd be a fourfold sense of belonging. So theology, geography, community, and family. And you say, well, how did we get to the situation that we're in right now, where some of these things are abnormal? And I can see a pretty clear pathway to getting to a radical sense of individualism. So let's start at the top on theology. Mm-hmm. You say, well, look at the state of the church. It's full of creeps, pervs, hypocrites, and frauds. I don't want to have anything to do with them. Had bad experiences. There are people who have been legitimately burned by some deplorably shady, scandalous things. Fair. Then you say, you talk about geography being embedded by a place. Nathan, you don't understand. My little town has tornadoes and no beaches. I really didn't like growing up there. Got to get out of there and away from those people. Plus, they thought differently about the world than I did, so I don't want to be in that place. Then you run that down to your family level. And I said, you know what? Dad's too busy. Mom's on anxiety meds, or neither one of them were around, or one of them didn't show up or whatever. And it feels like I'm doing more to take care of my family than they are to take care of me. And so I receive no comfort from my relationships there. And so those traditional fourfold belonging, family, community, geography, theology, no longer fit for people. And so we've deconstructed and gotten rid of all of those and said, well, here I am. I'm left with me just as the individual core to make it up. I have to be sympathetic to seeing how people could get there. But just because that you had bad experiences in all of those categories doesn't mean that there aren't good versions of that out there. But it starts with our relationship and our understanding of who God is, not how people have misrepresented him, that then backfills those categories. So I'm on one hand sympathetic to how we could get to a highly individualized concept of the human, particularly when we borrow the Christian concept of the value of the individual, which is true. But where the rubber hits the road here, Cameron, is I've talked to people who say, okay, I get the idea that I need community around me in order to know who I am, but I fundamentally don't trust the people around me to give me good advice.
Sure.
And I think that's a legitimate quagmire.
It's legitimate. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and there are no easy answers to that. If you find yourself in a community filled with people you can't trust, the first step is, of course, prayer. But yeah,
so,
I mean, it's going to look
see what you did there, but you're proving my point, because you're thinking about this Christianly, which I would expect of you. So, okay, I feel isolated as an individual. Yep. The normal secular impulse would say, therefore, I need a bunch of friends on social media. So I start to build the family. You talk about this like the Thanksgiving episodes of sitcoms. And also, so I'm going to build it from the inside out. And Cameron says actually it's going to start with prayer. So just recognize you're coming in from the other end of the tunnel here.
Well, and it starts, and the other big impulse is, okay, we take your community apart, deconstruct it, and explain away everything that's happened. Explain away maybe the core beliefs on the basis of the behavior. I think that's an understandable impulse, but it's always easier to destroy something than it is to build or to venerate something that exists. And I know again, the impulse of our age is tear down, because and to be an activist and root out the rot, the moral rot and all of that. And I agree, but I'm for reform. I'm not for revolution. I'm not for tearing things apart. I think what exists, especially if we're talking about the church, the person to whom you need to look first and foremost is Christ. If you find fraudulence there, then you have good reason to turn your back on him and his church. If, however, you meet the arms of Christ, the strong arms of Christ, and you see the cross and self-sacrifice and the beauty of his love, then it will allow you, free you to do the hard supernatural work of forgiving, which is something everybody has to do. We're all going to be hurt in this vale of tears by people. I mean, there's no getting away from being wounded. And there's no getting away from the fact that we're going to wound other people too. That's part of what it means to be a sinner. But the work of forgiveness starts with looking first to Christ. And those are the impulses. So the fundamental of prayer, going to God's word, running to his feet, rather than Michel Foucault or somebody else who's gonna give you a pickaxe.
Yeah, that's such great advice. I was thinking of, I think it's the little, there's probably a term for it. Like, what's it called when there's like a little phrase or a line of poetry, like at the beginning of a chapter of a book? Is there like a...
Oh, the epigram.
Is that what it is for each chapter? So it'd be the epigram. I think it's the 39th chapter of Middlemarch. There's a line there that I like. It's something like, a task too strong for wizard spells, the squire's action brought about. It's easy casting stones in wells, but who shall get them out? And you have this picture of like how easy it is to drop a rock down a well versus how hard it is to get the rock out of there. You know, it's a totally disproportionate. And so Cameron's idea of like, it's easy to tear things down, it's easy to destroy things, it's easy to toss the rock into the well, but to do the work of actual construction, digging a well or getting the stone back out once it's been thrown in is very, very difficult. And so, yeah, that's absolutely true.
It's an epigraph, by the way, just for the record.
Epigraph. All right. We've now been
epigraph.
educated.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I got that right.
Okay, so
and I did
your thing though,
yes.
I want to bore back onto forgiveness. I got a whole bunch of new thoughts going here. Because this is deeply embedded in my kids when they'll come home from school and say, this happened and it wasn't fair. And you know what? Oftentimes it wasn't.
Yeah.
And I can say, I'm sorry to hear about that. That wasn't the right thing to have happen there, but it did. And there's such an impulse, like they have this drive, like, but it must be fixed, and it can't.
It can't. Yeah.
And that's the hard thing. So I think there are probably people listening here who are frustrated and angry about the way they've been treated in the past, or the lack of love that they felt from other people, or and no one can actually fix that except Christ. That is the foundational reason of like what it is that the gospel does is it fixes things that nobody else can. So part of that though is learning to live with, and I like what my mom often told me as a kid, how do I know when I've forgiven? And she said, you know, you've forgiven when you can think about a situation and you're no longer angry about it. And so I think that's wisdom there of saying, are there things in your past that have contributed to the way that you are, that were totally out of control, that weren't your fault, that you can let go of? And what's even more sad, Cameron, is the number of people who internalize like something's wrong with me. When clearly that's not like, oh, if I hadn't been like this as a kid, my parents wouldn't have gotten divorced. No, that's not how that works. And so that beginning with forgiveness is, it might be a recognition of establishing reality of who's really at fault here, and then who can actually forgive, and what is my role in beginning that forgiveness process in order to gain some freedom from communities that are crippling us in unhealthy ways. So I would say lean into that forgiveness theme if you're struggling in these categories. Then here would be my suggestion for step number 2. Step number 1, forgive. Step number 2 is, I have never seen someone who feels like they're a part of a community who isn't also serving that community. You can never receive from a community enough to feel like you're part of it, which is counterintuitive. And you might want to push back on me here for a second, Cameron. I receive from the communities that I'm part of all of the time. People are gracious and generous toward me and bail me out of situations and help me out with odd projects and are continuously giving to me. And that's great, but that's not what makes me feel part of it. What makes me feel part of it is when I'm reciprocating that back in the other direction of how am I involved? How am I what am I contributing? So there's an economy to belonging that isn't just receiving. It's the giving and receiving part of it that makes us feel like we fit in and we belong in these different levels. So I would say forgiveness is a great starting point. And that'll look different in everybody's lives, but you might want to get some help thinking through that if that's an issue. And then how do I serve? How do I lean into this to establish people around me who know me? And through serving is how people know you well enough in order to help you understand what your gifts and skills are, because a lot of you listening are good at things you don't know you're good at, and you need other people to tell you that. And then there are some of you who are listening to this who really aren't good at something, and you think you are good at it, and you need somebody to kindly alert you to that as well. So it's through the service and through the engagement that we feel like we belong. And it's through forgiveness that we understand that there's a fundamental break in the capacity of human communities to form themselves properly, and that we need help from the outside.
I think that's well said. You have been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.